Chinese police collecting blood samples from residents but refusing to tell them why. It's not the first time it's happened either. Facebook shuts down a network of 155 fake accounts run by China. One of the network's targets was the 2020 U.S. election. China honored the 100th year anniversary of a late general's birth and praised his outstanding contributions. He was the one that gave the order to shoot down unarmed protesters during the 1989 Tiananmen Square Massacre. A key person in shaping Pompeo's hardline policy on China says the CCP has no allies, while democracies are forming an alliance to counter that threat. And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warns U.S. politicians to be alert of Chinese influence. He said local Chinese diplomats could try to woo them as part of Beijing's espionage campaign. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Villagers in China have been reportedly forced to give blood samples to authorities, but no one seems willing to tell them why. And it's not the first time the unusual practice has been reported.
First, we look to China's southern Hunan province. That's where locals say police officers have been collecting blood samples for residents. They're thought to be acting on orders from the Chinese regime. So far, the officers have provided no explanation. On top of that, the police officers reportedly haven't taken any measures to prevent the spread of the CCP or Chinese Communist Party virus. One villager, Li Yuan, told us that police didn't show any documentation when they came to collect samples. To protect his identity, we gave him a pseudonym.
He didn't have any relevant documents. If a certain department wants to collect blood, it must have relevant documents and must show them to everyone to make it clear. It doesn't work if they just do it at will this way.
Li said the person who collected his blood refused to tell him why the samples were being taken.
He said that the police station asked him to collect blood. He told me not to ask too many questions as if it's very confidential.
Li explained that many of the locals didn't want to give samples, but because the police officers came in uniform, they felt pressured into submitting. Li added that he felt the same way. He also recalled that no medical personnel were present when the blood samples were collected.
Many people have had their blood collected. I called them to ask about it. Now they're panicking. It's because of the virus transmission risk. Everyone was afraid and didn't know what was going on. What if it's contagious?
Later, Li asked his village chief and the head of the police station what the samples were needed for, but they told him they didn't know either. Locals say police mainly took samples from adult men. This isn't the first case of mass blood sampling in China. The Uyghur ethnic group in the Xinjiang region was subjected to it, as well as Christians and practitioners of Falun Gong, a spiritual meditation discipline that's been brutally persecuted by the regime for over 20 years. Other Chinese people also had blood samples taken, including those who were viewed as enemies of the regime, like human rights activists and dissidents. In the early 2000s, China's Ministry of Public Security began to establish a nationwide DNA database. According to Human Rights Watch, China's DNA collection practices may not be specifically linked to criminal investigations. Public security officers collect a large number of biological data from ordinary citizens. That's because the collection of so-called basic information is considered one of the regime's goals. But according to Chinese law, the collection of DNA samples by public security agencies should be limited to specific criminal cases. NTD News.
Now we turn to a ceremony held in Beijing, but not everyone considers it a reason to celebrate. Earlier this month, the party honored the 100th anniversary of a well-known military general named Yang Baibing, the same general who gave the order to shoot down unarmed protesters during the 1989 Tiananmen Square Massacre. On June 4, 1989, Chinese troops opened fire on students and citizens in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. The people gathered there were protesting the communist regime's rule. 10,000 people are estimated to have been killed. Yang died in 2013. A ceremony was held on September 9th to mark 100 years since his birth. A member of the Standing Committee of the CCP's Political Bureau, the regime's most powerful lawmaking committee, attended. Chinese state-run media reported that the event was held to celebrate what they called Yang's glorious life and outstanding contributions to the party. Hong Kong pro-democracy activist Joshua Wong is facing an uphill battle, but one he says he won't give up. This after a Hong Kong court rejected his challenge. Wong was disqualified from district elections last year. Wong expressed disappointment at the results, pointing to increasing control from Beijing. Despite the results, Wong still had a rallying cry for his supporters.
We will still continue the fight in such uphill battle. Even nowadays, the judicial system is under hardline control from Beijing.
Wong became an international figure after leading protests back in 2012 and 2014. And freedom of press continues to diminish in Hong Kong. Police announced they will now only recognize government-registered and internationally known foreign media. This is a crackdown on local Hong Kong media and journalists. Police say this is a necessary step against so-called fake reporters, citing the pro-democracy protests since last year. While 8 Hong Kong media unions slammed the move in a statement, saying it will seriously impede press freedom in Hong Kong, leading the city toward authoritarian rule. They added the move allows authorities to decide who are reporters, which fundamentally changes the existing system. They demanded the move be scrapped, or they would respond with necessary measures. Also adding that freelance reporters and media outlets not under government rule have for years been able to report truthfully to serve the wider public. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is warning U.S. politicians to stay alert over potential Chinese influence on American politics. During a speech in Wisconsin, he said Beijing sees local governments as weak links and opportunities to sway public opinion, but asserted that American officials must be prepared to counter it.
In a speech to Wisconsin lawmakers at the state capitol, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned of Chinese influence on American government and politics, especially at the state and local level. He said Chinese Communist leader Xi Jinping is aware that the U.S. federal government is pushing back against the CCP. That's why Beijing has been trying even harder to target local U.S. officials to circumvent America's sovereignty.
He thinks local leaders may well be the weak link.
The Secretary of State points out that Wisconsin's retirement system is investing in China Mobile and China Telecom. Both are state-owned companies and are an integral part of the Chinese regime's surveillance system.
Do you want your teachers, your firefighters, your policemen invested in those kinds of activities?
Pompeo came at the invitation of Republican Senate President Roger Roth, who had previously received an email from a Chinese consulate official asking him to praise China's efforts to control the virus. The senator replied with one word, nuts. Pompeo also cited another example of the CCP exerting influence on local politicians and working to silence their support for Chinese dissident groups in the U.S.
2017, a California state senator proposed a bill merely expressing support for the Falun Gong practitioners in America and in China. It was hortatory. It was a rhetorical resolution. These people that he was speaking to have suffered as tremendously under the Chinese Communist Party's crackdowns on religious freedom as any others. Unfortunately, the California State Senate bowed to the CCP pressure and shelved the proposed bill.
He said the State Department was reviewing the activities of 2 organizations of China's United Front Work Department operating in the U.S., the U.S.-China Friendship Association and the China Council for the Promotion of Peaceful Reunification. Pompeo said the groups are trying to influence U.S. schools, business groups, and politicians. He called on politicians from different sides to work together and counter the CCP's influence.
Telling the truth about China isn't remotely partisan. It's principled. Democrat, Republican, Independent. You have a friend in the Trump administration to help you push back against the CCP's exploitation of our open society. Let's do this together for the American people and the future of the greatest democracy in history.
Penny Zhou, NTD News.
A critical reason behind America's China policy says Beijing is becoming more and more isolated and has no real allies. The comments came during an online conference focused on Hong Kong. NTD's Juliet Song reports.
Always keep in mind,
a key China advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo
said China imposed a Cold War on the U.S. The advisor Miles Yu is one of the critical people behind Pompeo's China policy. The Secretary of State calls him a central part of his team. What sets Yu apart is that he was born and grew up in China. White House Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger said Yu's experience growing up under totalitarianism made him one of its most potent foes. Yu rarely appears in public, but in an online conference held by a Canadian think tank this Tuesday, he gave a speech saying there's no country in the world that's more Cold War conscious than China.
China views the entire international system as an endless struggle between the Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristic, and the rest of the world. So they want us to forget the systemic, political, and ideological differences between the two systems.
He said China's approach focused on highlighting common ground with Western countries in order to hide ideological differences. But under the Trump administration, this strategy no longer worked.
This administration said, no, we're going to focus on both common ground as well as the differences. We can no longer ignore the differences there.
You said that's why top U.S. officials like Pompeo and Attorney General William Barr talk about the real intention of the Chinese Communist regime.
This is the Cold War. It's not us imposed upon them. China imposed upon us. So
you added that almost every liberal democracy in the world recognizes the threat from the Chinese regime.
We're getting together to a very important multilateral alliance of some sort to deal with the China challenge collectively.
In the United Nations General Assembly this Tuesday, Chinese leader Xi Jinping said China supports multilateralism. A term in international relations, it refers to multiple countries working towards the same goal.
That is a complete reflection of lack of self-awareness.
He said multilateralism is based on shared values, like those between the U.S. and countries like Australia, Canada, and with the UK.
China has none that you can be trusted as a really true ally to share its value. North Korea is useless for the PRC for most part. Russia is playing hard to get a game with Beijing. So China is more isolated, so it's very ironic.
At the conference, Yu also warned of threats brought on by the Chinese military. He said the People's Liberation Army is more than armed forces for the communist regime, but also a global conglomerate for business and high-tech intelligence. Juliet Song, NTD News.
China's Xinjiang region again comes under the spotlight in a U.S. House bill with almost unanimous support. The Forced Labor Prevention Act aims to prevent goods made through forced labor from being imported to the U.S.
The House of Representatives passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act by a final vote of 406 to 3. The bill aims to ensure that goods imported into the United States from China's Xinjiang region are not made with forced labor. Republicans and Democrats alike supported the bill. They took to the House floor criticizing China's human rights record.
Millions of people who are being subjugated right now by the Chinese government. And despite international condemnation, atrocities continue in Xinjiang, and China shows no signs of changing course.
He noted a statement released by the Chinese Communist Party that defended the camps in Xinjiang, calling them vocational training centers. Republican Representative Michael McCall spoke of Beijing's hostility toward ethnic groups.
This is all part of a deliberate program by the CCP to wipe out their ethnic identity, their religion, their culture, anything that might compete with the Communist Party for their loyalties and affection.
This bill builds on the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act passed by the House in May that addressed abusive practices in the Xinjiang region.
European tech companies sell digital surveillance technology to China's security agencies involved in serious human rights violations.
An investigation by Amnesty International reveals that 3 companies based in France, Sweden and the Netherlands sold digital surveillance systems such as facial recognition technology and network cameras to key players of the Chinese mass surveillance apparatus. In some cases, the export was directly for use in China's mass surveillance programs. Amnesty International is calling the EU to tighten up its export regulation system. A spokesperson says Europe's biometric surveillance industry is out of control, a multi-billion euro industry that is flourishing by selling its wares to human rights abusers. The current EU export regulation system is broken and needs fixing fast.
French President Emmanuel Macron said his government has asked for a United Nations international mission into China's Xinjiang region. Macron made the announcement in a pre-recorded address to the UN General Assembly. According to the U.S. State Department, up to 2 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities are believed to have been placed in mass detention centers in the region. Detainees have allegedly been subject to indoctrination and abuse. Facebook said on Tuesday that it shut down over 150 fake accounts run by China. They include accounts posting about the U.S. presidential election. The statement says that those behind the accounts coordinated with each other. They also took operational security steps to conceal their identity and location through the use of VPNs. Facebook's investigation found links to individuals in China's Fujian province. The accounts posted in Chinese, Filipino, and English about global news and current events. They focused primarily on the Philippines and Southeast Asia, as well as the U.S. and its upcoming November election. They also covered Beijing's interests in the South China Sea and Hong Kong, among other topics. Facebook's head of security policy said the accounts violate Facebook's policy against foreign government interference. And Intel just got a license to continue supplying certain products to Huawei. New U.S. restrictions took effect last week that banned firms from exporting U.S. technology to Huawei, unless they get a certain license.
Intel has won U.S. licenses to keep supplying some technology to Huawei. That is despite new curbs that came into effect last week. Since September 15th, they've barred US firms from supplying or servicing the Chinese telecom gear maker. However, this week the state-backed China Securities Journal said Intel had been given some licenses. That was confirmed Tuesday by a spokesman for the US chip maker. Rivals are hoping to follow suit, though they weren't optimistic that non-US producers would be granted permission. Instead, chipmakers are reportedly working on plans to increase supplies to other customers. With US-China ties under strain, Washington has been pushing allies to squeeze out Huawei, which it says colludes with Beijing's intelligence agencies. The firm denies all such charges.
The American oil company Chevron has asked its global employees to remove the Chinese social media app WeChat from their work phones. The request makes the company one of the first to take action following President Trump's recent executive order, banning the app over what the White House deems national security risks. The oil giant reached out to its employees via a staff email, requesting that the app be deleted within days. Those who fail to comply will have their devices disconnected from the company's network. Neither Chevron nor Tencent have publicly commented on the matter. WeChat has become a top target in the U.S. crackdown on China, joining other Chinese-made apps like TikTok. WeChat boasts 19 million regular users in the U.S. and more than 1 billion worldwide. China and India have agreed to stop sending troops to their contested border in Ladakh. They've also pledged to avoid actions that might complicate the tense situation there. The two nations issued a joint press release Tuesday. It said both sides agreed to avoid misunderstandings and misjudgments and refrain from unilaterally changing the situation on the ground. Some Ladakh residents expressed relief over the development. But an expert from India has doubts over Beijing's credibility.
The Indian army need to be prepared and ready for any contingency or any challenge which can come, because it is difficult to believe what the Chinese are saying.
Thousands of Indian and Chinese troops are currently amassed along the disputed stretch of border. Sweden's state-owned space company says it will no longer renew contracts with China or accept new Chinese businesses. The Sweden Space Corporation provides ground stations that help fly Chinese spacecraft and transmit data. Its contracts with Beijing have allowed the Chinese regime to access its antennas in Sweden, Chile, and Australia since 2011. But amid a changing geopolitical situation, it's making the change. According to the Swedish Defense Research Agency, China could make military use of its access to antennas at a Swedish ground station. A professor of space law and policy said China wants to remove its dependence on the U.S.-owned GPS navigation system, adding that it's part of China's broader plan to expand its global influence. Now we turn to Beijing. In less than 2 years, China is destined to hold the Winter Olympics in its capital city. According to Chinese state-run media, 8 new venues are under construction and expected to be finished at the end of the year. Altogether, over 20 venues are expected to be used for the sporting event. Politicians across the world have expressed concerns over China's human rights record. British lawmaker Sir Ian Duncan Smith urged the International Olympic Committee to reconsider Beijing's host of the 2022 Winter Games. He is one of the co-chairs of the International Parliamentary Alliance on China, which consists of around 200 legislators from about 20 countries, including the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, Japan, Germany, and others. US Senator Marco Rubio posted in his Twitter account, "It's hard to believe while Beijing censors independent journalists, crushes freedoms in Hong Kong, and commits egregious abuses in Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and Tibet, China will host the 2022 Winter Olympics in just 16 months. How is this justifiable?" In some countries, cases of the Chinese Communist Party virus are rising again. Facing this, new attention is given to the quality of protective gear, and Chinese medical masks are once again shown to be not meeting the standards. One of the largest patient safety groups in the U.S., ECRI, says most of the KN95 masks it tested failed to meet U.S. standards for filtration. This exposes medical staff to a higher risk of being infected with the CCP virus. U.S. hospitals bought hundreds of thousands of KN95 masks from China since the outbreak, as a way to deal with a shortage of U.S.-made N95 masks. KN95 masks are the Chinese equivalent of N95 masks in the U.S. As the name suggests, they are supposed to filter at least 95% of airborne particles. But researchers at ECRI found that 60 to 70% of imported KN95 masks don't meet that requirement. Following our recent report on the arrest of Chinese dissident and poet Wang Zhang and his wife, which left Wang's mother and 4 young children under house arrest, some of our viewers asked how they were able to have 4 children. That's because, until recently, China staunchly enforced its famous one-child policy. The one-child policy was in effect until 2015, when authorities announced a slight lessening of the restriction. Now, families are limited to 2 children. The one-child policy led to many problems in Chinese society. For example, the ratio of younger adults to older adults began to shrink, causing problems for the country's workforce. Likewise, the population of men began to greatly exceed the population of women. That's because parents often chose to abort female babies in favor of having male children. Back to poet Wang Zhang. We can't confirm why he has 4 children. But normally, when Chinese citizens seek to have more children than is allowed by the regime, the mother must hide from authorities while pregnant. After the child is born, the parents are also forced to pay a huge monetary fine as punishment. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.